The 1980s marked a tumultuous period for the video game industry. It was characterized by oversaturation of subpar games and even a complete crash in 1983. But it also created one of the largest rivalries in the industry, where a relative newcomer managed to turn the tide against the entrenched giant Nintendo.
It may be the most addictive toy in history, and it's definitely the hottest thing this Christmas. Nintendo video games.
Called Nintendo.
Nintendo.
In the 80s, Nintendo emerged as the dominant force with the Nintendo Entertainment System, solidifying its position as the family console through quality hits like Super Mario Bros. And Zelda. However, Nintendo's reluctance to innovate and play aggressive created an opening for Sega. Led by CEO Tom Kalinsky, Sega employed a bold plan to outmaneuver Nintendo, leading to one of the most successful consoles at the time. The ensuing battle for consumers unfolds as a compelling exploration of the industry's resilience, competitive dynamics, and the transformative impact of strategic decisions. The 80s video game crash was a market collapse in the North American video game industry, characterized by oversaturation of low-quality games, lack of consumer demand, and poor business practices. It led to a significant decline in sales, profits, and in some cases, even bankruptcy filings. Key companies like Atari, Magnavox, and Intellivision oversaturated the market and led to a temporary downturn in the entire game industry. The next big player would have to deal with the bitter aftertaste on the consumer's mouth, as a very negative impression was created after this episode. The crash prompted industry introspection, eventually paving the way for Nintendo's quality-focused approach and the resurgence of the video game market in the late 1980s. From the launch of the NES in 1983 towards the late 80s, the video game market would be dominated by Nintendo and its Nintendo Entertainment System, as the company emerged as the dominant titan during the NES era, producing iconic titles like Super Mario Bros., Zelda, and Final Fantasy. At the time, Nintendo had solidified its reputation as the family console, dominating the market and beating rivals due to quality control. Nintendo even created a seal of quality, guaranteeing consumers that every game published on the NES will have to adhere to strict quality controls imposed by Nintendo. This, plus a strong catalog of games developed by Nintendo, led to a second wind for the industry. Nintendo started to get too comfortable and started to drag its feet with the development of a new system, as the NES was doing incredibly well. Nintendo reasoned that there was no reason to rush towards a new console, while the NES continued to dominate. Here's where Sega enters the picture. Sega was previously an arcade giant, but found itself pressured into entering the home console market after the falling popularity of arcades started to take a toll on the company. However, entering the home market was not going to be easy, as Nintendo had already dominated the market and was gaining even more traction, with Mario Bros. Basically becoming the Mickey Mouse of gaming in the late 80s. Enter Tom Kalinsky, the new CEO of Sega of America. Kalinsky came from a toy executive background, with a history of working on franchises like Hot Wheels and Barbie at Mattel. While Tom Kalinsky seemed like an outsider to the industry, he quickly grasped the most important dynamics and brought a fresh perspective to the table. Kalinsky's unconventional approach would eventually prove successful. Kalinsky presented a 4-point plan to outmaneuver Nintendo, initiate a price war, create a better bundled consoles with a hit game, focus on American-centric games, and embrace counter-positioning against Nintendo. The price war initiative was going to be key. Sega beat Nintendo to the 16-bit era and decided to sell the console for cheap, with the intention to recoup the losses on the sale of games. The Sega Genesis would be priced at $149, coming 2 years before the Super Nintendo, which would be launched at $199. On the system bundle, Sega decided to stop packing the console with games like Altered Beast, instead opting for bundling it with their so-called Mario Killer. Even if they lost profits the game could have made if sold separately. The priority was on the Genesis, gaining as much market share as possible. While the Super Nintendo and the original NES did have some sports games like Punch-Out and Excitebike, the games were focused on original gameplay mechanics, rather than games like NBA Jam and Madden, which were with popular franchises that the American public was familiar with. Its support of the American market and third-party developers like Electronic Arts would prove paramount to the success of the Sega Genesis in the United States. Last but not least, Sega marketing was all about counter-positioning against Nintendo, as Nintendo had successfully branded itself as the family console. Sega decided to diss Nintendo and mock it as a console for little kids. Sega went all out in branding itself as a faster, more violent and more grown-up counterpart, with games like Mortal Kombat having no censorship, and an emphasis on sports games of popular franchises. The results were incredible. Over a single generation, Sega managed to sell 29 million units of the Sega Genesis against 49 million units of the Super Nintendo. While it did not manage to surpass it, prior to the Genesis, Nintendo had basically a monopoly over the home console market, and the Sega Genesis managed to carve out a 37% market share for itself in only a couple of years. The favorable pricing coming out earlier, its relationships with third parties, and very aggressive marketing were all factors that contributed to the outstanding results of the Sega Genesis. Regretfully, Sega would get overconfident over these results and plant the seeds of its own shortcoming in just the same amount of time. After the success of the Genesis, Sega rushed to the next thing, trying to beat Nintendo again with a more powerful system, with better graphics in the Sega Saturn. Many consumers and developers complain about it being launched prematurely, with lack of games in development and therefore a lack of catalog at launch. The rushed nature of the endeavor meant that, according to developers, the hardware was complex to work with, and developers lacked support from Sega. Even worse, the Saturn was very effective on 2D games, but with the PlayStation also entering the picture and the Nintendo 64 coming out just a year later, the industry quickly moved to 3D games, to which the Saturn was not optimized for. With Sega trying to adapt against shifting ground, the Dreamcast came out in 1998, 3 years after the PlayStation 1 and 2 years after the Nintendo 64. Coming out in an already established base for the PS1 didn't help the Dreamcast, and Sega ended up pulling the plug on the console just 3 years later, in 2001, making it the very last console Sega released. While Sega ended up exiting the console market against the heavy pockets of Sony and the established brands of Nintendo, what Tom Kalinsky and the Sega Genesis managed to pull against Nintendo was remarkable. Sega managed to steal 37% of the market of Nintendo in the span of just one generation, and went head-to-head with the toughest player at the time, creating one of the few rivals Mario Bros. Ever really had. Sega's impact on the industry cannot be understated. Sega played a pivotal role in breaking Nintendo's monopoly, introducing innovation, and shaping the competitive dynamics of the video game market. The legacy of Sega's ventures continues to influence the gaming industry's approach to competition, innovation, and consumer engagement.